Welcome to the Interstellar Age. Season 2, Not Alone. Episode 11, See Vis Astra, 2280 to 2310. As the free worlds fought for survival on one side of human space, the rest of the species stumbled onward, largely isolated from the struggle, with their own trials and tribulations to occupy them. Since the signing of the Treaty of Mars in 2104 and the rapid expansion of humanity into space, Earth had gradually become more and more unified. The divisions and conflicts of the post-war period were not forgotten. Over the course of the 22nd century, some of these would boil over into relatively small-scale conflicts, such as the East Africa Insurgency, 2106 to 2111, the Second Chinese Civil War, 2112 to 2114, and the Russo-Turkish Dispute of 2117. But each of these in turn were suppressed or resolved by the GDA, and the old conflicts were gradually subsumed by the dynamic new age of exploration and colonization, and the new conflicts that arose therefrom. By the founding of the Terran Interstellar Union in 2204, the 200 independent nation-states of a century earlier had largely coalesced into about a dozen supranational blocs, each with varying degrees of independence. Despite the raft of newly founded colonies, Earth remained the only power of any consequence in human space. The planet's population had shrunk significantly from its pre-Third World War high of over 10 billion. More than 1 billion had died in the war, birth rates had remained relatively low even after Reconstruction, and hundreds of millions emigrated to settlements in Seoul and beyond. By the mid-23rd century, Earth only had a population of about 7 billion, roughly the same as it had in the early 21st century. But this made it by far the most populous planet in the galaxy, where the majority of humans still lived. This gave Earth massive clout in the colonial union. The TIU was founded with a federal structure in which each colony world functioned as a semi-autonomous state under the Union government. The Union employed a bicameral legislature, with a lower house whose membership was determined by population, dominated by representatives from Earth, and an upper house determined by state. In theory, this balanced out representation, but rather than Earth counting as a single world, like the colonies, each of the 12 supranational blocs counted as a state, with its own representatives in the upper house. In practice, this gave Earth a nearly unassailable voting advantage in both houses of Parliament, and despite its internal differences, Earth usually voted together on interstellar and colonial issues. The colonies agitated for parliamentary reform, demanding that each planet be given an equal voice in the upper house. In such a system, Earth would still dominate the lower house thanks to its massive population, but the upper house would better represent colonial interests. Earth blocked all these efforts, along with further colonial expeditions. There was now little population pressure on the homeworld. The economic benefits from the existing colonies were considerable and more than Earth needed. Many feared antagonizing potentially hostile aliens. Colonizing new planets or reforming the legislative system would eventually shift the balance in Parliament away from Earth, loosening the homeworld's stranglehold on colonial politics. Meanwhile, increased reliance on automation and the produce of the colonies led to economic and cultural stagnation on Earth. While growth had slowed in the colonies due to restrictive Terran policies, they remained comparatively dynamic. Colonists increasingly began to feel that Earth was simply holding them back. By the mid-23rd century, some in the larger colonies, particularly Eos and Taranis, were beginning to whisper of secession. Despite these growing issues, the TIU in 2250 reigned supreme. Neither the disunified wildcat colonies nor the technologically advanced and economically powerful, but small and intra-competitive, corporate worlds could hope to match the Terran Union's raw mass. By 2279, all that had changed. The victory of the Wildcat Alliance in the Frontier Wars, followed by their unification under the Coalition of Free Worlds, instantly created a credible military-political rival right next door to the TIU. The TIDF Navy dwarfed the Free World's Navy by a factor of 5 in number of ships, but the Free World's Navy had real combat experience, had demonstrated tactical and operational skill, possessed advanced new weapons and ships, and had a military prodigy for a leader in the person of Admiral Wolfe. The Terran Navy was hidebound, obsolescent, and had no experience beyond running down pirates and terrorists. In terms of ground forces, both the Free World's militias and the Union Army made heavy use of automation and drones, but in the TIDF, this tendency was taken to an extreme. Most frontline units were fully autonomous, whereas Free World or combat units focused on teaming human soldiers and Marines with machine systems. Furthermore, as part of its founding charter, the CFW encouraged member states to institute some form of mandatory service, either a draft or a mixed military community service program. Many member states, including Frontier, also saw high levels of voluntary enlistment in military and paramilitary organizations in the face of the Kyran threat. In the TIU, meanwhile, few citizens had any stake in their own defense, even in the colonies. On Earth, there was virtually no interest in defense whatsoever. This was one reason the Union Parliament had been so reluctant to provide any assistance to the Alliance during the war, instead opting to pursue a diplomatic solution, a dead end that had served only to make the Terran government look even weaker and more out of touch. But the political will to do otherwise had simply not existed. With the unfavorable comparisons between the TIU and the CFW growing, what had once been a fringe secessionist movement suddenly went legitimate. From 2280 onward, the question was no longer whether Eos or Taranis would attempt to go it alone, a prospect which appealed little to many residents and which the Union government could have prevented by economic pressure or force. Now, any colony might not only secede, but join the Free Worlds. If the coalition accepted the seceding worlds' petition for membership, and the TIU attempted to force those worlds back into the Union, the crisis could rapidly escalate to war. The outcome of such a war would be far from certain, even with the Terrans' massive material superiority. Indeed, if it became a protracted struggle, it might hinge on the involvement of another party, either the Kyrans, the Vergonids, or the third power in human space, which was just then coming into its own. The first corporate colonies were founded in the 2150s with a curious mix of raw capitalist competition and wide-eyed idealism. On the one hand, each of the space corporations wanted to expand their interstellar foothold as rapidly as possible in a bid to exploit untapped resources and corner the colonial market ahead of its rivals. On the other, the leaders of the colonial projects themselves genuinely wanted to foster a spirit of endeavor and independent enterprise, believing that expanding and exploring in this spirit would benefit all of humanity. Most of the early corporate colonies were a haven for entrepreneurial-minded settlers, from space miners to small business people to freehold farmers, anyone who wanted a middle ground between the dangerous freedom of the wildcat colonies and the restrictive safety of the Terran Union. These ventures proved wildly successful. Colonial economies boomed. By 2200, each of the Big Three had moved their main headquarters from Sol to the largest of their respective colony worlds. In those early days, it was a true frontier, an untrammeled cosmic wilderness where anything seemed possible, without the shadow of exploited natives and destroyed cultures hanging over it as during Earth's colonial age. But this idyllic time could not last. After the Surya Offworld merger in 2210, power began to consolidate in fewer and fewer hands. In the early days, new colonies were founded as privately owned, publicly funded ventures. The colonists were given an ownership stake and a share in the colony's success, usually between 20 and 30% of the colony's total shares. This equaled a fairly impressive sum when colonies were valued in the tens of billions, split between a few thousand colonists. In theory, this value would increase as the colonies grew in both value and population. In practice, this was rarely the case. Once the pressure of competition eased, VentureStar and Surya Offworld began finding ways to reduce the value of colonists' shares, either through contract loopholes or simply buying desperate colonists out. Sometimes, it was alleged, creating the economic conditions for that desperation themselves. By 2250, the Big Two had gobbled up most colonist-owned businesses, either absorbing them into official company operations or allowing them to remain nominally independent while in actuality a subsidiary of the megacorporation. Colonists also had to sign new contracts, where before they had been corporate citizens, now they became employees in all but name, with a commensurate limitation in rights and liberties. With that, the Big Two effectively became soft totalitarian regimes. No secret police, no killings, no camps. Just less and less freedom, less and less independence. Everything from food to culture to education was company-owned and company-operated. Predictably, this swing disincentivized emigration from the TIU and the Coalition to the corporate worlds. But by the late 23rd century, domestic control and unrestricted economic expansion had made each of the Big Two a financial and industrial powerhouse on par with the free worlds, and increasingly a threat to Terran economic dominance. On the military side, neither VentureStar nor Surya Offworld was a naval power of any significance. Minimal police-style forces were sufficient to maintain order, but after formal trade deals were signed, the Big Two increasingly came into possession of the latest weapon and ship designs from the free worlds. While their military forces remained small, these were little threat to the TIU. But with the corporate world's massive industrial potential, they could theoretically build a well-armed fleet in short order. The Terrans hoped that the lure of cornering trade with the Coalition might fuel a new competition between the Big Two. Instead, it seemed to spur only further cooperation. Through the 2280s, VentureStar and Surya Offworld launched a number of expeditions to Spinward, searching for new colonial and resource opportunities they could jointly exploit. One of these expeditions found a potential colony world already inhabited by an advanced sapient species, the Melakene, with whom the corporate mission made first contact in 2289. Despite their strange, naked mole-rat-esque appearance, the Melakene are remarkably human-like in biology, culture, and language forms. As a result, xenologists have long speculated that life on Earth and Malak might have a common panspermic ancestor in the very distant past, but as yet no conclusive proof of this hypothesis has been uncovered. The Melakene had, at that time, a level of technology and scientific knowledge roughly equivalent to that of humanity, with a recorded history of similar length. But they had never independently developed FTL technology, and so were confined to their home system. They proved eager to trade with humanity, both culturally and materially. Clearly, they were particularly interested in gaining access to Star Drive. Predictably, the TIU urged restraint on this matter, to the level of virtual non-interaction. But as an advanced spacefaring civilization, the Melakene did not fall under the purview of the Helvetios Accords on non-intervention, and voluntary bilateral trade would not violate the non-exploitation provisions. The Big Two signed a trade agreement with the Melakene Solar Government in 2291. More first contacts followed. While the TIU stagnated, the Verganids continued to explore ravenously, though they too had little interest in colonizing. In the course of their journeys, they made first contact with the Ara in 2295. This enigmatic amphibianoid species had long ago independently developed a Star Drive analog, which they used to expand to a number of stars in the immediate vicinity of their home system. These star systems were highly developed. Xenologists estimate that the Ara had been in space for at least 10,000 Terran years by the time of contact, and to this day they possess technology far more advanced than humans or Verganids. But they chose not to expand beyond this small sphere, and while they were willing to establish peaceful relations with the younger species, they remain enigmatic and aloof. As of the early 26th century, they have never shared their incredibly advanced technology with outsiders, or participated in any galactic conflicts or accords. Yet another shocking upset to the galactic balance of power came in 2300, when Surya Offworld and VentureStar announced that they were uniting their two colonial empires under the aegis of the Organization for Interstellar Growth and Cooperation. This constituted a merger of unprecedented scale and scope. Outside the jurisdiction of the TIU, there were no antitrust laws to limit such a move. The Terran government announced new trade restrictions in response, but given a thriving trade with the free worlds and a booming domestic economy, the OIGC was undeterred. On the other side of human space, the Coalition discovered a number of other sapient alien species, but all of them were slaves and conquests of the various Kyran clans, making formal contacts with them impossible. Then, during one of their frequent recon missions to search for Kyran outposts, the Free World's Navy made first contact with the cetaceanoid Kyran in 2306. Like the Melekene, the Kyran were technologically on a par with humanity and the Virginids, but lacked any FTL capability. Seeing the economic and political cultural advantage the trade relationship with the Melekene provided the corporate worlds, the CFW made a similar deal with the Kyran in 2309, further isolating the increasingly isolationist TIU. Emboldened by the Union government's diplomatic weakness and the continuing reticence of the earthbound political class to engage with parliamentary reform, political parties on Eos, Taranis, and Rama were founded whose explicit goal was to leave the Union and join the Free Worlds. Still bitter about the failure of the Terrans to provide any support during their life-and-death struggle against the Kyrans, the Coalition's leadership refused Earth's demands to disavow the possibility of taking in seceding Union colonies. Their official position remained that any independent world who wished to join the Coalition could do so, provided they met the economic and military contribution requirements. Every human world has the right to choose its own destiny, as Admiral Wolf told a Terran reporter in a rare interview in 2310. The looming war clouds created a moral crisis for humanity's oldest ally. The Virginids felt their loyalty was to the entire human race, not its frustratingly fractious polities. The Greater Hive tried to serve as impartial mediators in these growing disputes. Virginid mediation prevented a number of crises in the 2290s and early 2300s from exploding into conflicts. But while respect for the Virginids was nearly universal among the various human factions, even they could not hold back the tide forever. By 2310, the human galaxy was sitting atop a volcano. Independence movements were growing in strength. Major TIU elections were coming up in 2312, and early polls projected that secessionist parties might well gain power on Eos and Taranis. They had both pledged to immediately hold referenda on seceding and joining the Free Worlds Coalition. If such votes passed, as polling predicted they would, it would almost certainly mean war between the Coalition and the Terran Interstellar Union. Fearing such a conflict was inevitable, the TIDF had undergone significant expansion since 2300. But while elements within the Terran Navy had tried to learn some lessons from the Free Worlds Navy's successes against the Kyrans, the organization as a whole remained wedded to the old doctrines and methods. Hidebound admirals still refused to change the old ways, when they had yet to be proven wrong by the blood of their sailors. Still, the TIU's resources were vast compared to the Coalition. Any war between the two would either be a short, sharp, localized affair, which the CFW would likely win, or a long, drawn-out attritional struggle, which might swing either way. In that case, each side would likely seek aid from the OIGC and the Virginids. If either or both of these powers became involved, all of human space would be devastated, and the whole colonial project might well collapse. But while the eyes of the galaxy were on the shifting lines between the CFW and the TIU, the spark that would ignite the inferno was being struck in the corporate worlds. In 2297, a small Venture Star resource survey mission arrived at a system well beyond the furthest corporate outpost. Long-range scans had shown the system was unusually rich in rare elements useful in advanced manufacturing. The survey team discovered something they did not understand. The report they filed with corporate HQ kicked off a flurry of secret activity at Venture Star. Knowing that their sometime competitors in Surya Offworld were interested in the same system, they called a secret conference between the two boards to decide how to proceed. The following year, a second joint mission was dispatched to the system. Publicly, this was simply another in an increasing number of joint resource expeditions. In fact, it was a combined military, scientific, diplomatic flotilla, its objective to establish a permanent mission in the strange, uninhabited system. This mission would form the center of corporate operations for the next decade, under an impenetrable veil of secrecy. For in this system, on the edge of explored space, the corporate worlds had discovered the source of the mysterious UACs that had been observing humans and Virginids for centuries, and the course of history was about to change forever.